It is my pleasure to welcome you to this presentation by James Yékú from the University of Kansas, which is part of our ongoing speaker series organized by the Transborder Digital Humanities Center Consortium, or TBDH. I'm Silvia Fernandez, Principal Investigator to establish a center consortium of TBDH, a Mellon Foundation funded initiative housed at the Interdisciplinary School of Engagement in the College of Liberal and Fine Arts at UT San Antonio. It is an initiative that fosters community engaged digital research, teaching, and collaboration on transborder and borderlands cultures, with a focus on the US-Mexico borderlands, local and transnational experiences across the Americas. Rooted in critical border studies, translanguaging, and heritage languages, ethnic and race studies, gender and sexuality studies, responsible computing, and digital humanities, TBDH supports scholars at all levels through mentorship, training, digital resources, and expertise exchange. By bringing together interdisciplinary researchers, educators, and community partners, TBDH seeks to expand ethical and responsible approaches to representing border stories in the digital cultural record. To get this started, as part of TBDH mission, we are honored today. I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who has supported this event, from our founders, TBDH co-PIs, and fellows, speakers, and contributors, to those who are watching today. Gracias, thank you. Your intention are invaluable in making this series a truly inclusive space for dialogue. To get started, as part of TBDH mission, we're honored today to welcome Dr. James Yékú, whose research exemplifies this critical transnational engagement with African digital humanities. I will pass the word to Subadra, one of our Spanish MA fellows, who will introduce him. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is truly a privilege to introduce Dr. James Yékú. He is an associate professor of African Digital Humanities at the University of Kansas, a recipient of Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship, and the author of two monographs: Cultural Netizenship, Social Media, Popular Culture, and Performance in Nigeria, and The Algorithmic Age of Personality, African Literature, and Cancel Culture. He also leads African DH programming at QU and co-organizes the annual Africa DH Symposium, most recently held at the University of Ghana in June 2025. In his talk, Crossing Digital Borders, DH in Africa in DH, Dr. Yékú will explore how African digital humanities serve as border-crossing intervention, one that remains digital space through post-colonial and African theoretical frameworks, drawing on initiatives and collaboration from the University of Kansas and beyond. He examines the politic of representation, data ethic, and AI in African digital landscape, while emphasizing the importance of community and ethical collaboration in building resilient DH networks. We are truly delighted to welcome James Yékú with us today. Following his presentation, we will open the floor for a Q&A session, so I encourage you all to engage with his work and bring your question to the discussion. And now, please join me in welcoming James Yékú.
Thank you so very much for the kind introduction. And I'd like to share my screen, but also would just want to thank everybody for joining the call and to say I'm honored and privileged to have been invited to be in conversation with you all. Can everyone see my screen? Great. So again, thank you all for being here. I see a couple of familiar names on the screen. I'm grateful that you have joined us, and I'm looking forward to some of your questions and comments after all of this. I'd like to begin today just by demonstrating how African DH is fundamentally a border-crossing intervention, especially one that is based on a transnationality that is shaped by the conscious platforming of African voices and projects within DH. In other words, to do African DH is to be in dialogue with histories, narratives, and languages that operate beyond the political colonial era borders of African nation states. So drawing on African DH initiatives at the University of Kansas, where I'm based, I'd like to stress today the importance of post-colonial and African critical approaches to DH scholarship. Of course, scholars such as Ropika Risam and several others have shown the value of this kind of work, particularly as it relates to overturning the coloniality of power with digital tools and methods that are fundamental to how we undo a lasting effect of colonialism and challenging, of course, the dominance of Western knowledge systems. I'll close my talk by exploring how community plays a very important role in shaping African DH. And that's with a view to showing a sense of the kind of ethical collaboration that has guided what we have done at KU in the last 5 years. And by we, I like to say that I'm referring to my colleagues at KU, especially Brian Rosenblum. That's a founding co-director of the Institute for Digital Research and the Humanities at KU, and of course, other amazing colleagues. As a matter of fact, that would also include Sylvia, who was with us in the US in the first couple of years when the whole program started. I think it's also a good idea to note very early that my sense of DH in Africa doesn't necessarily include North Africa, and that's for obvious cultural reasons. It also doesn't include South Africa, and that's because of some reasons I will outline shortly. Although I need to say that we actively seek collaborations in those regions. For example, we work with colleagues from DASA, that's the DH Association of Southern Africa, and collaborate with groups like SADILA to organize programs. And with DH 2028 going to Cape Town, we're indeed excited and look forward to more of such collaborations. But I actually think the South African situation is quite unique. Some of you may remember about a decade ago when Melissa Terrace identified physical DH centers around the world. And from the screen, you can see that South Africa was the only African country identified on that infographic. Today, this will probably look something like this. In addition to South Africa, you find other countries like Nigeria, Cameroon, Kenya, and Senegal right on that map. In other words, DH centers and academic programs have sprung up in these countries, and I think they're doing really quite well. There are also other active DH initiatives in computational linguistics, for example, in Senegal, and digital heritage preservation work in Kenya and other parts of East Africa. And if you ask me again, I would say these various activities consolidate the strong presence of DH praxis on the continent. Now, having said that, I believe despite these ongoing conversations, the establishment of formal academic centers, DH summer schools, as well as DH conferences in several places in the last couple of years, there's something about DH work on the continent that is not always visible, especially in the mainstream Euro-American context. And there are probably several reasons for this particular invisibility. But I would like to suggest one particular reason in addition to all other factors, and that's what we might call the idea of a single digital story of the continent. And I think this particular single story of Africa, this single digital story of Africa is precisely why the work we have done at KU has been largely contingent on the need to deconstruct this particular kind of narrative. And by a single digital story, what I mean precisely is this. Although Africa is important to the digital humanities, as I like to believe it is, the field has often failed to acknowledge this reality fully. I suspect it's an indifference to the continent that I believe is a result of a critical imbalance in the dominant scholarly narrative of DH and technological engagement with Africa. So this single digital story, and this is the point I'm making, is often reductive and incomplete. It focuses mainly on a rhetoric of technological lack and digital exploitation. And I believe this serves to construct Africa as some kind of digital order. So when otherwise well-meaning colleagues discuss Africa and digital technologies, the conversation is usually framed through a language that centers on the digital divide, on things like limited access or on extractive data practices. You also find things like the idea of the continent as some kind of unchanging ecological wasteland for the global north's production of digital cultures and objects. It is as if Africa is an antithesis to the narratives of technological progress in the global north. So what you find is that this essentialist view undermines African agency in digital scholarship and produces the conditions under which the continent becomes sometimes ignored in global DH scholarship. For example, as you may note from the screen, mentions of Africa and the digital divide and African extractive data practices in the academic literature in the last 25 years has seen some kind of steady increase. Those discussions obviously started in the 1990s. And by those discussions, I'm talking about discussions around the digital divide in Africa, limited internet access. But it was in the 2020s that you find this growing scholarly interest in ideas of connectivity and equity issues, and all of those kind of discussion just basically became a big deal. And I believe those debates also aligned with the whole scholarship that was beginning to emerge on data colonialism and digital ethics. I want to say at this point that I am, of course, very sympathetic to these kind of issues I've described. I've written about this issue of data extractive practices. My latest monograph, as a matter of fact, mentioned earlier, offers some kind of literary sociology of the profit-based algorithms that supports outrage culture on social media. So I understand this single story very well, but my point is that it cannot be the only story that we offer when we think about African digital subjectivities. And the reason for this is that I believe a narrative that focuses on the precarious conditions of, say, in the AI age, the precarious conditions of the humans in the loop that sort and label data for companies like OpenAI or Meta, to focus on their conditions alone sometimes obscure the work of those who are actually connected and doing a whole lot of other stuff. So my argument is that Africa also needs to be recognized and affirmed as a core site of digital innovation, a space where people are building AI factories, institutions and individuals are creating and building Afrocentric NLP models to decolonize weird AI systems and provide a more inclusive digital record, one that makes AI models more inclusive of cultural and linguistic context, especially from the global south. This project, Biafran War Memories, is a digital archive project that collects oral histories on the Nigerian Civil War, started by a team in Nigeria who curated this particular project to tell the stories of the Nigerian war. And I think a project like this is really important, especially in a space like Nigeria, where the political elite actually loves to forget the past and would not commit to funding those kind of projects. I like to also mention that in addition to that kind of project, you have archiving.ng, which basically provides a fully searchable online database of old Nigerian newspapers, again, as a way of intervening in the Nigerian past. And perhaps it's important to mention what a scholar, Lila Gandhi, describes as the amnesic condition you find as a result of the colonial moment in Africa, in which many post-colonial African countries are bent on this logic of official forgetfulness. So as an antidote to that, you have a lot of private interventions, a lot of community-driven DH work on the continent that try to undo that kind of ahistorical sensibility of the political class. If you go to East Africa beyond Nigeria, you find you find projects that also create digital archives and do all kinds of visualization to, again, tell the stories of local communities and document the important cultural heritage of a number of countries in East Africa in this particular instance. Now, I mention all of this project because at KU, this is what motivates the work we do. We are not just interested in the fact of extractive data practices, the fact of digital exploitation. We think that narrative is important, but the argument is that that narrative is not sufficient, and that cannot be the only narrative that constitutes the landscape of the digital humanities in the African contexts. So, for example, archival records indicate that the first IBM supercomputers arrived in countries like Kenya and Nigeria as far back as the 1960s, just shortly after the British left those regions. And of course, this supercomputers may not have been used for humanities work, probably for scientific and economic activities, but they laid the foundation for the kind of solid tech startups you have in places like Nairobi and Lagos today. And I just wanted to mention that as one example of the kind of work we have been committed to showcasing at KU in the last 5 years. But the specific modality of the work we have done at KU has been through the programmings and events we have curated. We started in 2020 with the African Digital Storytelling, where we worked with Xavier and a couple of other speakers to bring together different African DH scholars and practitioners, communities on the continent who are doing a whole lot to document the African past and to tell the histories of their communities. And the good thing about this is that it's perhaps the only exclusively Africa-focused DH conversation in the Northern Hemisphere. And I think that is important. There are other Global South, international, DH events happening all around. And we try to plug into those spaces. But the good thing about the program we have curated at KU is that it offers a platform for African projects, mostly by Africans. And for me, that's really important. And another thing about the program is how it has encouraged a lot of South-South collaborations. The panels, the discussions, the workshops we have had have been aimed at encouraging discussions that the center, again, the hegemony of Euro-American epistemologies, and just try to center what is specifically African in terms of the archive and the data sets we're working with in Waterview. We're focused on archives, we're focused on AI and African languages, which in many ways I think have some, yes, I have this particular visualization that to document some of the themes we've had over the years. And this is, I do want to emphasize how NLP, work, AI, and languages appears to be the most dominant thread in the 5 years of our programming. And that speaks to how languages, African language, obviously because of the linguistic diversity of the continent, you have a whole lot of linguistic work, a whole lot of computational linguistic work coming out of African DH scholarship. I do want to mention that apart from the symposium itself, which is now in its 5th year, we also have occasional DH conversations, and we call this digital indabas. And the aim of this again is to showcase, you know, DH work from the continent, but in a more relaxed conversational setting that allows people speak to the particularities of what they are doing on the continent. The most, I think, important development in the last couple of years is actually leaving the US to go to say Ghana to hold this event. We think that's really important, especially if you consider the fact that because of the history of colonialism, you have this fact of an absent archive on the continent, right? People always have to travel from the continent to other parts, other places, especially in the global north, to engage with African cultural and historical materials, right? So this model that allows us go to Ghana and go to the continent to hold in-person DH conferences in a way allows us to undo that dynamic and be in conversation with colleagues on the ground. And for me, that has really been important in the last 2 years. Of course, we have a number of colleagues who join us from the US, but the emphasis and the focus of these gatherings has always been the cultural materials on the ground and the work of colleagues who are in conversation with us. And of course, we're in conversation with them as equal producers of knowledge, if that makes sense. We're not going there with any assumption of some superior technical expertise, right? We go there with a sense of humility and to collaborate ethically. And I say that also realizing that US location confers some kind of, comes with some kind of assumption of, say, infrastructural and economic power, right? We're coming from a place where there's funding, there's institutional, capacities for DH work. Despite all of that, we've gone to Ghana at least in the last 2 years with this sense of working with people who actually are doing solid work. And I think that has been very helpful. And for me, the whole idea of African DH as a broader crossing initiative emerges in that kind of context, especially when people have to travel from different parts of the region, from Senegal, from the Gambia, from Cameroon, from Nigeria, people crossing borders, literally to be part of these conversations. And it's not just physical borders, it's also linguistic borders, right? You have people you have Franco in June this year, for example, we had a fully Francophone panel, Francophone African DH panel, something we have always tried to do, not to center this common Anglocentrism of DH, right? So you're creating and curating a lot of these events, and you have this massive Francophone section in West Africa, and you do realize you do have to bring those communities in conversation. So in that sense, you have different kinds of borders being crossed. I don't want to make a distinction between African DH and Afrikaner DH because I get a lot of questions about that a lot. And for me, it's important to see that the work we do in the context of African DH at KU operates in the context of Black and Afrikaner DH to an extent. But while Afrikaner DH, Black DH is more concerned about issues of of slavery and the afterlives of slavery, social justice, anti-racism. The post-colonial condition in Africa animates the concerns of African DH rights, especially with respect to like I mentioned earlier, the undoing of the lasting effects of the history of colonialism and the kind of gaps and absences that is created in the archives on the continent. And of course, beyond the colonial moment in Africa, you have the situation worsened significantly by a political class or a terrain of governmentality that basically doesn't fund DH work. At some point in Nigeria, for example, the government banned the teaching of history in secondary schools, right? And that speaks to the kind of engagement with the past the government has. The government would rather forget. And in that kind of context, what you have is many people, private individuals, a lot of folks in the informal sectors, a lot of community partners will push back against such a historical disposition by building archives, building tools, looking for digital methods to document the past and preserve, different kinds of cultural heritage. So the focus of African DH is connected to the contradictions of the post-colonial state in many ways. Unlike African DH, where we're dealing with more everyday realities with regard to systemic racism, social justice, and the afterlives of slavery. But of course, for both, I think what Kim Garland has referred to as a technology of recovery is important, especially as it brings forth Garland right to the full humanity of marginalized peoples. So whether it's in a context of African DH where people who are peripheral to the spaces of power use digital tools to rearticulate their voice, or whether it's in the context of the US where a lot of Black people use tools to recover the full spectrums of their human possibilities. You have this idea of DH operating as some kind of recovery technology, and I think that is really important. As I bring all of this together, I don't know if you guys observe, for some reason, my presenter notes, and we had this before people joined the call, my presenter notes just refused to work, and I discovered that the notes I printed are actually incomplete. So I'm just winging it. I hope it makes sense. So I think it's important as I bring all of this together to mention that there's a lot about the work we have done at KU that connects to this idea of diasporic engagement, the African diasporic engagement on the one hand, and also an engagement with African diasporic archives. But the point I do want to make is how you have a lot of people who are external to the continent who live abroad, whether as Afrikaner scholars or just African scholars in the diaspora who do a lot of African DH work. For instance, Frederick Maduro's work on Islam West African collection brings together materials from Burkina Faso, Togo, Côte d'Ivoire, collects photographs, videos, audios, especially as all of this pertain to Muslims and Islam in those regions in the Sahel. And I think this is an important work that also, again, highlights the important place of DH in the African context. This is coming from the diaspora, and so is this project by Jennifer Hart, based here in the US. Accra Wala, the name of Jennifer Hart's project, is also significant, especially because it uses the transport infrastructure of Accra to spatially represent the city. So what you have through this project is an urban exploration of a major Ghanaian city using GIS tools and other digital methods. Again, another project we have showcased at our KU event, especially by inviting Jen to talk about her work. And so is this work also from out of the US, but again, Tinashe has moved around quite a bit. But this is an important work that curates the intellectual history of Zimbabwe. And what it actually does is to build a database that collects the history of books published since the 1950s. I think the project is currently down and has been trying to do some upgrade on the site, and so people can probably get to visit the site at some point later. But I wanted to signal this as another project that comes from the diaspora, and of course, my own digital Nollywood is also important as a diasporic intervention in African DH, right? And by that, I'm basically thinking of a project that's, I know, a simple Omeka project really that was envisioned as as a reconstruction of the material history of post-colonial filmmaking in Nigeria. There's something that you may that I've said that you may have noticed. It's the fact that the Nigerian state does not like to remember the past, right? So in Nigeria, you have a culture not just of official forgetfulness, but also largely a culture in which the material infrastructures that anchor different cultural industries are in a state of obsolescence, really, right? The archives are endangered, again, because of the political will that is absent, but also more like an everyday culture that doesn't necessarily value preservation. So I began to collect these posters as a way of thinking about the history of Nollywood. Nollywood is a Nigerian film industry. In terms of production output, it's the second biggest industry in the world. And the sad thing about Nollywood is that it has evolved over the years at a material level through a logic of disappearance. As it produces films, a lot of its materials for production actually disappear or become obsolescent, and nobody is interested in preserving this kind of data set. So I began to think about using these posters basically to introduce a kind of preservationist discourse in the context of filmmaking and scholarship on the continent. But I think what is important from a broader perspective is the kind of language that also comes up in one of the sections of this project. The section Orolati Enuamon Agba Òṣèré Yoruba is an important aspect of this project that I think offers some kind of nod to a multilingual DH, especially as it centers Yoruba, a major African language that is spoken in about two to three countries, on the continent, and also very much used in the context of Santeria and Candomblé in Cuba and Brazil, in the context of indigenous spiritualities in those countries. So this is an important language that again is intended to decenter this focus on English as the default and dominant language of DH, especially in Euro-American context, right? Anyway, I just wanted to mention this particular example because I think it's important, again, to think about how African languages are fundamental and central to the identity of African DH in many ways. Perhaps in closing, I just want to highlight that African DH is community driven in many ways. So if you had, say, 10 to 20 digital humanities projects from Africa, I can speculate that over two-thirds of this project would be by community actors, people without no formal connections to the university environment, people who do not necessarily define their work as digital humanities scholarship, right? So when we went to Ghana last year, when we went earlier this year, our disposition was to seek out community partners and be in conversation with them, right? If they actually want to, right? Because again, respecting the agency of people, respecting their subjectivities mean we're not going to, like I said earlier, as people with any superior technical knowledge or expertise, right? We're going there as people who want to learn. And it's been really gratifying to see how these different communities come together to deepen the conversations we've had over the years. And perhaps there's something else I need to highlight about this, and that's the whole idea of funding, right? I mean, Erhard reminded us in 2015 that formulations of digital work are constructed by national contests, especially those that are shaped in part by funding and reward systems. And I say this a lot in the context of African DH, right? What counts and what becomes valued as digital scholarship has a lot to do with, the kind of funding that is available for that kind of work. In a Ghanaian context, Brian and I and the other colleagues who went from KU are very excited to find the authorities at the University of Ghana actually putting their money where their mouth is, right? Sponsoring this event and making it possible for some kind of ethical collaboration to take place, right? Whether with academic partners on the University of Ghana campus or DH practitioners outside the university environment. The fact that we've gone to Ghana twice and I've had events that were partly funded by colleagues in Ghana is really important for me, especially given that even here at KU, we do not necessarily have the African DH program is not necessarily a formal program. It's just a set of initiatives, Brian and I have been committed to, and we have a lot of support from different people. But at an institutional level, there's really nothing ongoing as it were. So when you go to Ghana, you go to Africa, so to speak, where people are always excited to talk about the constraints of infrastructure, the idea of technological catching up as something, as if that were peculiar to Africa. It's really cool to see this commitment to DH work, and I just thought that that's something worth highlighting. And I'm not suggesting that you need funding for ethical collaborations. On the other hand, I'm saying that it's much easier for us to work with colleagues when we are able to decenter the power asymmetrics that come with our positionality as scholars from the US, right? And so for me, in a space like this, I think it's important to, give a shout out to those guys at Ghana. And of course, shout out to Sylvia, who's been there from the beginning, who continues to support our work. And probably just also thank all of you for being here and for listening to me. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, James, for this amazing presentation. I think we all learned a lot of valuable information today. I would like to start with the Q&A, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay, I would like to start with a question about your own experience. What challenges and opportunities do you encounter in creating a multilingual digital space that aims to represent diverse African voices ethically and I'm sorry, collaboratively? Yeah.
Yep. Thank you so much. That's an important question, and thanks for asking that. So when you have people who speak different languages come together using a formally colonial language, it gets really interesting, right? You have Francophone speakers, you have English speakers, but none of us actually have these languages as our first language. So the group is inherently multilingual, right? Because you have people who are dealing with materials from different languages and who have to converse in a say Francophone or French or English, and right. So for me, what is important is to be able to give space for all of these languages to, to be present and to be able to bring together archives and materials that speak to these different communities and languages. And what we have done so far through all of the programs we've had, through all the events we've created, is to have this space where all of these languages can be present. And we have seen the impact of that kind of work in the last 5 years, right? I would say we've had over 20 countries represented in our programming the last 5 years, and well, different languages that are present. And for me, that is really important. In terms of my own personal DH work, the Digital Nollywood project I showed, the Yoruba aspect of it, is also this attempt to not just have materials and data sets in English, but to have something in my own indigenous language as a way of being in conversation with my own culture in this DH space. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you so much for your answer. If anyone have a question, you can raise your hand or write something in the comment section.
We actually have a comment in the
Okay.
chat, and that's from Stephanie Gonzalez. She's asking, what advice would you give students to students or emerging scholars interested in African DH?
I think a good way to start is to first acknowledge that there's such a thing as African DH to begin with, right? The bulk of my talk is actually to say that there is a single digital narrative about the continent out there that elides and obscures much of the conversations happening in African DH, right? Because there's this fixation, I suspect, on this crisis of digital divide, internet access, to technological constraint, and I think all of that is important. But I think that particular focus obscures the work of those who are digitally connected and doing a whole lot of work. So the first thing will be to acknowledge that that work is ongoing, and then to be in conversation with scholars in the field who do that kind of work. Invite them to your classes, right? I can count about 10 monographs that have been written on different aspects of African digital cultures, African digital humanities. Buy the books, invite us to talk about them, or attend conferences. We hold different events every year. Please attend those events, come support us. But for me, that's one way, that's probably the best approach, or where one can start from, just being in conversation with people who are actually doing that kind of work. And also, I know it's difficult sometimes to travel down to the continent for different reasons, right? But if it's possible to go to attend a DH event on the continent, please do it. It's safe and it's fun.
Okay, so I have a question as well. What has been the challenge from the online to the in-person work that you've been doing, and how were those challenges overcome? You can give us some examples, for instance.
Yeah. So for me, the first, before the challenge, the good thing about the online model was we had a whole lot of people able to join us from different parts of the world, right? So I am particularly an advocate for online conferences because of what we saw during COVID, how effective things, were. So the possibility of access, the possibility of having more participation in the context of African data, especially, we're able to reach more people online. But transitioning to the in-person model was strategic for us. It was important to be able to go to where the work is actually being done, go to where the people are. And to be honest, it's expensive to do that. It's expensive when you don't have a Mellon grant, when you don't have funding, especially from this this part of the world. And that's why earlier I wanted to, give a shout out to the Ghanaian colleagues who said, James, Brian, you guys can come over, we'll commit to this financially. So for me, the greatest challenge has been funding. But again, it's a growing community and just having this amazing network of support both here and on the continent has been helpful to transcend this particular challenge of funding.
James, thank you so much for your talk and seeing all the work you and everyone involved has been doing throughout the years. I'm wondering specifically what you mentioned, how African DH, it's not a program in the University of Kansas, but it has a network with institutions, with practitioners, with librarians in Africa, in the US, and other parts of the world. So how do you envision this in the future? And if there's the need to have a program, or is it better to have this transnational network that can work in that way? I'm wondering about that specifically with the Transborder Digital Humanities, as we are planning what's next, and we have learned a lot from your work. I'm wondering about your situation with what you mentioned.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. I think it can honestly be both. It can remain this transnational network and community of practitioners and scholars who are devoted to, the digital cultural records from these particular communities, right? At the same time, it can also be a program, and that's our goal at KU, that at some point we're able to develop a strong institutional space that allows more formal programming around African cultural records, So I imagine a kind of conversation between an existing African studies program and the digital humanities, right? I'm currently in the process of creating an African DH and AI lab that is dedicated to some literary ephemera from British West Africa. And the goal of that lab is to create some kind of interdisciplinary network of African scholars, African studies scholars, African humanities scholars, and say computer scientists and programmers here at KU, just to be able to have a program that really gets something going, right? And hopefully we see what emerges from there. So my short answer is I think it can be both, right? As you consolidate your transnational activities, you're bringing people together, you're in community, you're ethically discussing different possibilities and the limits and the promises of what we do. We can actually have a program where some kind of digital pedagogy is present, mentorship for students, grad students is available. Something I didn't mention earlier is the role of graduate mentorship in what we have done so far in 5 years. I am always excited to work with, doctoral students, master students who are interested in the digital humanities, and most of them have been the drivers of what we do, as a matter of fact. And it's not just, it's not an appropriation of the energy of the doctoral students. It's an acknowledgement of what they bring to the table in terms of innovation, in terms of dynamism, and it's been really great working with people who are, excited about that kind of work. So for me, the program in Angle allows those kind of mentorship and advisory possibilities, even as we continue to deepen, the various activities we have with people from all around the world. When we went to Ghana in June, we had a workshop specifically for librarians. We call it DH for librarians. And one of the things that has come out of that particular event is, and Brian has been working on this, is the possibility of having someone in the information studies department visit KU. And I know the current political moment in the US forbids some kind of, traveling for people from certain parts of the world, but hopefully that kind of arrangement works. Again, as part of this commitment to a transnational network of scholars and practitioners interested in this kind of conversations.
We have a question by one of our graduate fellows, Cristina Ortiz, and she's asking, well, she commented first saying that the topic of Nollywood and how many of its methods are considered obsolete reminds me of the animation industry in the US and how hand-drawn animations aren't easy to create because the technology has become obsolete. So her question is, how does DH work help conserve movie making methods, or is the focus on conserving the culture?
I think DH work indeed helps to conserve and preserve different methods for movie making, right? And in so doing, digital humanities methods also help to preserve and conserve the culture, right? So for me, in the context of digital Nollywood, one of the possibilities I envision is to create internet memes and curate internet memes from, say, the classical era of Nollywood. And I'm talking about Nollywood movies from the 90s. For some reason, these movies are producing internet memes that are being used today. So one of the things I'm interested in doing is to curate a section in digital Nollywood where people can engage with internet memes from the 90s, but these memes are actually being used in the present for all kinds of cultural commentary online. I think that's one way, an important aspect of the film landscape becomes a way of conserving and preserving the culture. I'll be happy to take more questions if anybody has.
Dr. Christine Mapes has a question. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, so I really enjoyed hearing a bit more behind the scenes, a bit more of the story, and then also the contextualization of your work, James, and certainly a huge fan of the African DH Symposium. I'm coming at this question kind of very humbly from the experience of the Global DH Symposium, and I'm just curious about what the experience has been kind of navigating cultural norms of the institution of like KUs and cultural norms of organizing events, of doing kind of the business of things with the time frame norms of then collaborating institutionally with the University of Ghana. And if that's been seamless and you're just like, what problems might you be alluding to? I would be interested to hear about that, but I'm also just really curious to know about just how those collaborations work, not always or maybe specifically kind of person to person, but almost institution to institution. And I'd love to hear about that so that I can also learn.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And I'm also a fan of the work you do, and thank you so much for the space you curate for Global Scholars of DH. So I think your question is important, and you probably maybe know the answer already. It's crazy. It's crazy the institutional bureaucracies we have to deal with every year. Well, at least we dealt with last year, and of course this year, especially again in the context of funding. We can probably reconcile time zoning and differences easily and try to work things out. But when it comes to actually transferring funds from place to place, that's where the issue is. Last year, we I mean, just to speak to this transnational collaboration, we had funding for a Ghana visit from Ghana, from Sweden, from the US, and I think from South Africa, from Sadila, the guys, you know, and just to be able to coordinate buying plane tickets for whom and, getting somebody to pay them honorarium. It was a whole lot of work. And for me, that's somebody asked about the challenges earlier. That's another major challenge. But again, it's tied to funding in some ways, right? Just being able to coordinate things like that. But within the context of KU specifically, I'm glad that as long as people know what they are doing in terms of some of the and there are lots of financial admin people who help our work make it seamless. But sometimes people get moved around and without the institutional history as to how a particular office works, it's difficult to say how do you pay some kind of international scholar who is presenting online, or you're going to Ghana, do you send money? So I would say the greatest challenge has been in the context of just being able to do common, I mean, maybe some kind of transfer or trying to process some kind of honorarium, or you have a unit who pledges to support a program and they are not able to process this particular, support in terms of the pragmatics of the payment itself because of different institutional and bureaucratic bottlenecks. So those are concerns. But as to the other issues, I think the KU environment is pretty good in terms of the support it offers, and for that I think I'm glad we have people in place who understand the culture, who have been around for long. The KU work, the IDRH or DH work at KU has been ongoing for much longer than the African DH work. So someone like Brian has a whole lot of institutional experience that helps our work. But I know that just getting to pay people is a big deal.
We have a question from Stan West, and he's saying that thanks for adding impetus to indigenous language trending over colonial ones in film and literature. It's not only empowering, it adds authenticity to your stories. So how do you manage the backlash?
I really don't care about the backlash, to be honest. And the reason I say that is English is not my first language. I've had to learn English, right? So to center my language at the expense of English is is something I have to do. I don't have a choice. So if somebody wants to come at me because of that, I just ignore them, right? But to be honest, I really also have not experienced much backlash. Some guy actually decided to do some kind of a review of the Yoruba section of Digital Nollywood, the indigenous language section, and wrote a scholarly paper on that particular section, and got it published in a journal that actually supports multilingual scholarship. And I thought that was good. So rather than backlash, what I've seen is actually, a lot of commendations and, positives, right? But I wouldn't stop using my language because of any backlash. And I don't think you should either.
Exactly. James, I have a question in regards to, like, all your work has influenced digital humanities overall. It has sparked a lot of issues of multilingualism, of collaborations. I think all this work shows a lot of the efforts also seen with librarians, with community members, and I would like to hear what has been the outcomes that you have seen with the group you work, as to how African DH has influenced the whole digital humanities community, and I think, yeah, what has the group has learned to continue doing that transgress some of the limitations we see in digital humanities, or what it's resisting, and it's doing good overall.
Yeah, that's a great one. I think the first thing that comes to my mind is the fact that DH 2028 will happen in Cape Town, South Africa is a big win for African DH, right? And for me, I can't overemphasize the significance of that, right? And hopefully that speaks to the possibility of coming out of the margins, right? And being more centered and central in mainstream DH. And for me, that's a win, and I would take that any day. There's of course the lingering and persistent issues we have to continue to call out, talk about all of this marginalizing of indigenous languages, non-Euro-American cultural and linguistic context in the framework of AI, for instance. AI basically reproduces some of these biases and the encoded assumptions and stereotypes of the old digital cultural record. So with AI, what you have is an inevitable proliferation of all of that. Now, despite all of those, we still would take that win and hopefully continue to have more engagement with African DH. And for me, what I really want to see is more fiscal responsibility from the African side of things, right? To the extent that we are able to fund our own infrastructures, we're able to commit to, like the model at the University of Ghana. Actually, the way I say it is that you can't have decolonization without economic empowerment. You have to put your money where your decolonial mouth is. And I think I have that statement in my book. So shout out to my book. Sorry. But the point is you do need to commit to funding the things that matter to you, right? So I I take the wins, around here. I'm grateful for the support at KU from people like you, from everybody who is attending this, coming to listen to you talk about African DH. Thank you, right? So all of those are wins, right? But at the same time, a lot needs to be coming from the continent, and that's why our work at KU is always focused, looking at the continent to platform and make visible what people are doing there.
Thank you, James. We're about to finish. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
the insightful talk. If there's any other questions, comments, feel free to reach out to James. And I will like to thank everyone for joining us this evening for the second presentation of our three-part speaker series. As we can see, online allow us to invite three of the speakers. Dr. Yékú, thank you so much for your engaging and informative presentation. This presentation will be translated into Spanish and uploaded to the TBDH YouTube channel in the coming weeks. We invite you to join us next week for the next talk in our series with Kristen Mapp's presentation entitled "What is Global Digital Humanities? Reflecting on Opportunities and Challenges." And you can follow at Transborder DH on social media and visit transborderdh.org to stay connected and learn more about our work and upcoming events. Thank you again to the Mellon Foundation and UT San Antonio and to the support of our co-PIs and UTSA fellows. Have a great evening, everyone, and we will look forward to our next presentation and discussion on Transborder DH next week. See you then.
Bye, everyone.